Please state your full name for the record. Do you know Robert Bundy?
Ted Bundy is a name that chills America to its very core. He's one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history. A sadist and a psychopath, he charmed female victims before raping and killing them.
Ted Bundy had a personality of a Richard Speck or Jack the Ripper.
Bundy admitted to 30 murders in the 70s. Experts say his true death toll may be more than 100.
Society deserves to be protected from me. I'll kid you not.
It might be humorous if it weren't so serious.
Edna Cowell Martin was Bundy's cousin. This is her first on-screen interview, and she breaks the family's 50-year silence on life with one of America's worst ever mass murderers. Edna, thank you very much indeed for coming on to Uncensored.
Yeah.
I've known a lot about
thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. I can't even begin to imagine what it must be like to have been somebody who was a close family relative of one of the most notorious serial killers in history. So let me just start by asking that question. What's it been like to you to be one of Ted Bundy's family?
Yeah, well, I went from a person who I really looked up to. I mean, Ted was my cousin. He was also a close friend and a buddy, and we hung out together. So it came as a terrible shock. I mean, we couldn't even believe it. Nobody believed it at first. So yes, it was stunning to find that out.
And life ever since, when you, I don't know if you, I mean, do you tell people that you're related to him? Do you keep it a secret? I mean, obviously now you've come out with a book, you're telling your story, but what have you done in the last few decades?
Yeah, so exactly right. It's been a big decision because for the last 50 years, I've done everything I could to avoid letting anybody know that I was related to Ted Bundy. I didn't want people to know because I was so horrified. I didn't want them to know that he was my cousin. And actually, Ted and I were really good friends. I had moved back to the Seattle area to attend the University of Washington for my junior and senior year, so I got an apartment just a few blocks from Ted. I mean, we could literally walk to each other's place in about 6 or 7 minutes. So I saw him frequently, so we became really close. My friends really liked him. We all looked up to him. He was really a cool guy. He'd been doing these great things at the state capitol in politics, and he would regale us with these amazing stories about what he was doing, going undercover in the opponent's camp, working for the re-election of Dan Evans. So we thought he was a really cool guy. And then to find this out was so shocking. None of us believed it. In fact, we thought it was a big mistake for a long time.
Right, and I'll come to that stage of this story, but just to sort of paint a picture of family life for you guys. Even though you were a cousin, really, you've described him, I think, in the book as more like a kind of older brother figure to you.
Yeah, he was. I mean, his family and my family hailed from the Philadelphia area, and my parents moved out here in the late 40s. And then my father wrote to his mother, Louise, urging him to move out to the Seattle area so that she could start a new life. She was a single mom, and back then they called them unwed mothers, and she had this little 4-year-old boy that she really thought needed to start a new life, and so she took my dad up on that. And so we were the only family they had in the area. In fact, they lived with us for almost a year until she got a job and met the man she was going to marry and had 4 more kids. So we saw them frequently. And we had a cabin out on the beach, and they would come by. We'd have family barbecues together. So we were really close. We saw each other a lot.
Was there anything in young Ted Bundy, when you look back, which gave any, and by young I mean very young, in his early childhood, was there anything you ever saw when you look back on it now, with a different eye, obviously, and different knowledge about what he turned out to be, anything that gave any hint of anything unusual?
That's the irony of everything. I mean, I never detected anything. My brother was really close to him because Ted was 5 years older than I am. And I was a little kid, and so I tended to play with the other little kids, and he hung out with Ted a lot. But he he noticed that Ted really liked, even when they were fairly young, these really sort of lurid detective novels, which my brother thought was a little bit risque for his age group. But I mean, that was it. We never really saw anything that was out of the norm as far as Ted went.
One of the reasons
it wasn't until later that.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the reasons he became very infamous very quickly was that he was a handsome man. He was clearly intelligent. He had a charm about him. You were related to him. You hung out with him a lot. When you went to university, he'd come around a lot. He'd hang out with you and your friends. And he had normal relationships with women as well. And I'll come to the other stuff in a moment. But for all intents and purposes, this is a normal young guy, right?
Yeah, normal, good looking. My friends really liked him a lot. He would come by my apartment frequently. He was also always a welcome guest. And we would all gather around him because he would tell us these stories, and we were just kind of in awe of him. He was working for the Seattle Crime Commission. He was working on how to prevent crime against women. He wrote a pamphlet on rape prevention for women. We thought he was a really amazing guy. He was doing all these good works, and he was good looking. We were college students, so we were wearing our scruffy, jeans and long hair. He was really put together, really buttoned up, very handsome. He would wear a sweater draped over his shoulders with the sleeves tied around the front. And we just thought he was a really cool guy, thinking, oh man, 5 years from now, maybe we would be doing something like this. So
quite extraordinary,
everybody liked him.
Given what then happened. Now, there's a moment in the book where you see Ted dancing with one of your roommates following a dinner party.
Yes.
Tell me about it. It was a roommate called Margie, I think. But tell me what you saw and why it unnerved you.
Yeah, I mean, so Ted came over. That was a great evening because he showed up with a bag of groceries because we were always starving. So it was great because we fixed dinner, and afterwards we put on records and we were dancing around, and I had turned around to put on another record that was a little bit slower. And when I turned back, he was doing a slow dance with Margie, and she had her head leaned against his shoulder. And I looked at him and I didn't even recognize him, Piers. He had this really intense, mean look. His jaw was clenched. He looked angry. He was looking down at her, which really disturbed me. And his eyes, which were these beautiful blue eyes, had gone coal black. And I didn't even recognize him. I thought, who is this? And so I yelled out to him over the music. I said, hey, Ted, are you okay? Is something wrong? And finally, I stopped the record and yelled again, and then he snapped out of it at that point. And Margie looked up at him, wondering what was going on, and then the mask dropped, and he went right back to his normal self. And then I thought, well, that was weird, but you don't think that person's a serial killer at that moment. But the weird thing that happened right at that second was he said, I've got to go. And he just turned around and left right at that moment. I have no idea where he went after that.
I mean, the really chilling part of this is that this happened just months before his first known murder in 1974. And it was your roommate's good friend, Linda Ann Healy, who was his first known murdered victim. You knew her, you'd met her. When you heard that she had died, obviously you didn't know to start with that he was responsible. But when you heard that she had been killed, what were your thoughts then?
I was sick to my stomach. So it started off that this was in, I believe, the very beginning of February, she disappeared. And we did not know for months what happened to her, Piers. We were absolutely devastated. We, for college students who didn't go out and get the paper, I got the paper every day. We were searching for any word of what happened to Linda. And then after her, that was just basically one a month started disappearing. 4 of them within walking distance of where I lived. One of them, who was violently attacked and left for dead, lived just across the street and around the corner from me. So if Ted had walked from his place to my apartment and around the corner, that's where he would have gone to get that poor woman.
And of course,
So
you had no
it was-
idea it was him. What were you feeling as a woman yourself?
None.
A young woman, you're there, all these young women are being killed. You must have been pretty terrified
Yeah.
yourself.
We all were. In fact, you know, I used to walk to campus or ride my bike to campus, and it got to the point where we didn't want to go alone. We would buddy up with somebody else. I'd had a job just around the corner as a server in a restaurant, and I quit that job because I was afraid to walk home at 2 a.m. in the morning by myself. We were terrified. Terrified of my cousin, and I didn't know it.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. And in fact, he went out of his way to make it look like it couldn't possibly be him. I understand it from the book that he even helped you put locks on you and your roommate's apartment to keep you all safe because of the news of a serial killer on the loose.
Yep, that's true. He came over. Now, I had moved out of my apartment and moved into a house. And my brother shows up with Ted in tow, and he has this barrel lock because he didn't feel like our door was safe enough. So he goes and he's putting the lock on the door, and Ted is in the house, giving him, you know, just little tips and teasing him about it. And I'm relieved because I'm glad there's another line of defense. And here, all the while, the monster is in my house. And Piers, all he would have had to have done was knock on the door, and I would have let him in.
I mean, quite extraordinary. He was so unlikely to be him, according to everyone that knew him, that the police were looking for someone named Ted who drove a tan Volkswagen. And when they turned up, you said, "Hey, Ted, you drive a tan Volkswagen," and he just laughed. It was kind of unthinkable to everyone that it could actually be this Ted with his tan Volkswagen.
Oh, yeah. So Ted pulls up to our house. My boyfriend at the time, Don, was there, who's now my husband. He pulls up, and we look out front and see the tan V-dub, and he comes in, and we have the newspaper right there, and Don can't wait to show him the front page. There's a composite drawing of this guy that had attacked these women out at a lake not far from Seattle. And they also had overheard that his name was Ted, as you pointed out. And so we thrust it into his face and said, "Hey, Ted, this looks just like you." We were joking because we felt sorry for him that this was going on.
How did he react?
And he did. He just laughed. He goes, "Oh, I know." I mean, he says, "I'm doing everything I can to help." He said, "The police are just doing their job." And in fact, he said, there are about 40,000 VW bugs in the state of Washington, which was about right at that time. There were a lot. They were everywhere. And about 400 people with the name of Ted that own VW bugs. I found out later it was more like 100, so he exaggerated a bit. But he seemed perfectly calm. He could lie so easily. He had no trouble making it sound like that he was just helping out.
The first time he was arrested for kidnapping in 1975, he was suspected of being responsible for the dozens of missing or murdered women in the area. But to start with, you believed him when he said he was completely innocent. When you look back, why were you so easily duped by him, do you think?
I think I wanted to believe it. I didn't want to believe that my dear cousin could be responsible for these horrific crimes against women that looked just like me. And, of a mutual acquaintance. It was beyond belief. I didn't want to believe it at first. And back then, news didn't travel as quickly between different jurisdictions. The information was trickling in. And so we were just starting to learn about these things. So it wasn't until I came back from Alaska that things started changing for me.
Well, there was a pivotal moment when you picked him up from jail after his arrest and stopped in a bookstore. And you noticed that he was kind of lapping up attention from members of the public because he'd become kind of infamous. And you write in the book, Ted's arms were outstretched wide, a street corner messiah, and he was slowly turning in a circle. From his smiling lips, he chanted over and over, projecting for all to hear, "I'm Ted Bundy, I'm Ted Bundy, I'm Ted Bundy."
Yeah.
I mean, was that the moment? You said in the book, this is the image that haunts me the most. The image 50 years later makes your heart rate surge? Because was that
It's
the moment?
still-
Was that the moment when you realised it was him?
Yes, and it still gives me chills now just hearing you read that section from the book. I noticed a bunch of people running down to the corner because I was finishing up at the bookstore, and I got a terrible feeling in my stomach that something was going on. And so I went down there, and as the crowds parted, in the center of the crowd was my cousin, Ted Bundy, doing just as you described, standing there with his arms outstretched, turning like he was a messiah, actually acting proud that he was Ted Bundy. And that's the moment that I realized that he wasn't who I thought he was at all.
And you saw the kind of same jet black eyes, the expression that you'd seen when he was dancing with Margie that time.
Yeah, that's right. And it was as if he had transformed into somebody else. He let the mask down during that time period, and he wasn't the Ted that I knew. He was somebody else. And Piers, I ran up to him. I slapped my hand over his mouth to shut him up, and grabbed him and pulled him off that corner and hauled him back to my car and threw him in there because I was so appalled. And then I get in the car and I go, oh my God, I'm alone with this guy. And I drove him home afterwards. And I was absolutely terrified because sitting in my car was not my cousin. Sitting in my car was somebody completely different. And I turned and looked towards him, Piers, and he was just smiling at me. And I thought, oh my God, I hope I make it.
Terrifying. Absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
Did you tell the police about your belief then that he was probably guilty?
You know, it's interesting. After that, I don't think the police ever interviewed me again. They had their suspect. They were building a very strong case against him. So I don't think I talked to Robert Keppel, the chief detective, after that. I had talked to him several times before that. But I don't think that I talked to them again after that.
And how were your family about it? Were they all, when you presumably you must have all been talking about this, when you expressed your belief to them that you thought he was guilty, in the book you say that some of them clearly just didn't want to believe that. And did that cause a bit of a problem in the family?
Well, it didn't, because they didn't see what I'd seen. If you had been in my shoes, the total transformation that happened to me in a matter of seconds, where I had gone from hoping and praying that it was mistaken identity to complete conviction. Nobody else had had that kind of experience. So it's understandable why everybody came to the decision at their own pace. And I did tell that story to my parents, and they slowly had to believe me. And it wasn't really long after that that they did as well. I mean, they were heartbroken to have to believe it. But it was a tough transition for us.
He was first charged with murder in 1976, but then managed to escape prison in Colorado in 1970. He then carried out more murders, including 2 sorority sisters and a 12-year-old girl in Florida. He actually called you the night before the escape. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I had not talked to Ted at that point. So yes, this was New Year's Eve of 1976. And I get a call, or it was the night before that, I get a call from Ted Bundy. And I hadn't heard from him for a long time, which I thought was very unusual that he would call me. And on one hand, I was excited to hear him. On the other hand, I was just appalled to be talking to him. And so we talked about a few things, and then he said to me, well, what would you think if I tried to escape? I said, no, I don't think you should be doing that. In fact, no, do not attempt to do that. In fact, he had escaped once before, and I said to him, it didn't go well for you the first time, and I don't think it's going to go well for you the second time. You need to go through this trial. Do not escape. And we ended the conversation shortly after that because I didn't tell him things he wanted to hear at that point.
Did he, once he knew you didn't believe him, and his protestations of innocence, did that change the relationship irrevocably?
Yeah, I did not communicate with Ted again until 1980. So, of course, after he escaped, it was terrifying because we thought that he was going to come to me because he often dropped by. And so those moments were terrifying. I mean, we barricaded ourselves we were living in a little trailer at the time. But then I did not communicate with him again until 1980, and I wrote my first letter to him. And then I wrote a series of letters to Ted. The first one was in 1980 because, quite frankly, another book had come out about him, and I wanted to get his reaction because he was just sensational. People could not leave him alone, and they were fascinated with him. So there were a lot of books coming out, and I wanted to hear what his reaction was to that. So that was the first communication we had. And he was very excited to get my letter.
I mean, the sheer scale of what he did, 30 murders, but believed to be many, many more, possibly hundreds more. When you realized the full scale of what he'd done, as someone who had once loved him as a close family member, how did you feel about what you were hearing?
I was very, very angry at him and deceived and betrayed, just every emotion that you can possibly imagine, Piers, and heartbroken for his family. He had 4 other siblings and his mother, Louise. I mean, this was her son that had done this, and all the attention that they were getting. And of course, we were hiding out. And all the families that were devastated by what he did. And so many of the young women, they still don't know where they're buried.
Yeah.
And that just absolutely disturbs me to this day.
In one of the letters to you, and when you wrote to each other, he said, "I have no guilt, remorse, or regret over anything I've done. What's done is done." Really shocking.
That is a shocking thing to say. And I really, as you see in those letters, I really went after him. He was sitting on death row, just feet away from the execution chamber. And I was telling him, this is my chance to tell him, hey, Ted, this is your opportunity to do something right. I mean, it's not going to absolve you of your sins, absolutely not. But it's your opportunity at least to do something for these families, especially the girls and the young women, their family who don't know where you left their remains. And he just completely ghosted me, shined me on, put me down, patronized me. And as you so aptly read, just what's done is done. And then he quoted me scriptures of all things, which I thought was pretty insulting.
Did he ever admit to all the crimes to you? Was there ever a moment when he finally came clean?
He never admitted to me. Piers, I think that I represented family. I was the normal part of his life, and he could never cross that abyss and admit to people like me or other people that he loved the terrible crimes that he had committed against women, just like me, who looked so much like me and my girlfriends. He never did.
I mean, that in itself is such a disturbing thing, isn't it? That you were so like his victims.
It
and
is.
There he is hanging out with you and your roommates, having fun, being normal, having girlfriends, having normal relationships, and yet quietly, without anyone knowing, he's on this mass killing spree, constant.
Yeah, I can't believe it. I mean, from January of 1974 through July of 1974, 8 women, I believe, were attacked and murdered. One of them survived, but the others did not. And all that same time, Piers, he was dropping by my apartment, visiting, acting like everything was normal. Hey, one time that he came by, I had at that time moved into a house with some girlfriends, and the dog who had seen him before, this time he came to the door and the dog started going crazy. That dog's name was Jeffy, and he was a great dog, and it was great to have a dog that would alert us when people arrived. I looked out the window, saw Ted's VW Bug, which, by the way, I had ridden around in during that time, the same car at the same time that women were being transported to their doom. And Jeffy was going nuts. And finally, my roommate and I opened the door. We had hold of Jeffy's collar, and he attacked Ted, went biting at his ankles and his feet, and I've never seen the dog like that. His hackles on end. He reared up. We could barely hold on to him. We finally physically had to haul him off into a little, like the bathroom or back bedroom, and he just threw himself bodily against the door, howling and, trying to get our attention, and we ignored him. And so we were profusely apologizing to Ted. Oh, God, we're so sorry. We don't know what got into him. What do you think? Do you think that dog detected something? Why didn't we listen to Jeffy?
Right. I mean, the dog must have picked up on something. He was executed by electric chair in Florida in 1989. Did you go to his execution?
Yes. No, there was some discussion. I had met up during that time with a Seattle Times reporter, Richard Larson, who had become a friend of Ted's down while Ted was working for the re-election campaign of a really popular Governor Dan Evans. And so I reached out to Richard Larson because I figured he'd be one of the only ones that would know what I was going through, because he was deceived by Ted too. So I visited him frequently, and he worked for the Seattle Times, and he made a proposition to me that maybe I could go to Florida to see Ted, that maybe I could get him to reveal at that time were some of these, to some of these murders. And I really considered it, but at the time when I went back home and started talking to Dawn about it, we realized that he would never convince me or reveal that to me. And also, looking at his letters, it was obvious that he was never going to admit that he murdered these women and tell me where the bodies were. And I also didn't want to subject by then my 12-year-old daughter to any kind of media attention, and so I decided not to go. So no, I didn't go. My parents went and visited him there, but I didn't go.
His story has become one of the most infamous in modern American history. You, as just by association, will be forever inextricably linked to him. And now you've done a book. It's a brave thing to do, to write about this. I guess some people, and I'll put this to you, some people will say you shouldn't be profiting from the appalling crimes of your serial killer cousin. What do you say to people that say that?
Right. I waited 50 years to write this book. I didn't want to be associated with him for the longest time, but it was really getting to me, Piers. I had this bottled up inside of me. I couldn't even talk about it. When somebody would bring it up, I would be so stressed out about it. In fact, when I was talking to the woman that became my publicist, and I was kind of talking to her about this possibility as a book, she was sitting across from me, and apparently I was so stressed a blood vessel burst in my eye, and she's madly texting underneath the table trying to find out if this is a medical emergency and was relieved to find out it wasn't. And it wasn't until I got out in the parking lot that my daughter noticed it, and I was like, oh my God. This has not been easy for me, Piers. I really waited this long because I couldn't have done it any sooner, and I did not want to cause any pain to the families, but I felt like their stories needed to be honored as well, and I definitely have a story to tell, and that's why I wrote Dark Tide, Growing Up with Ted Bundy.
What do you want people to get from the book?
That I think that you can overcome all kinds of adversity, and that it is good to talk about it. I probably shouldn't have held it in me as long as I did. It didn't, this has been a great opportunity to talk about it with my daughter, who was walking on eggshells for most of her life about this subject. And this really brought a lot of things out. We really became, not that we weren't close before, but it bridged a divide there. And I just think it's important to, that we're all vulnerable to trauma in our lives to some degree. And I think it's important to talk about it. And I hope that it helps someone else by doing it.
How do you feel about his celebrity status? the big interviews he gave in prison, which obviously were watched by millions of people.
Yeah.
The Netflix series recently, I watched that. It was a dramatization of him. People say it glamorizes what he did. It makes him, seem kind of something very different to what he was, which was a ruthless, predatory serial killer. How do you feel that we live in an age where people like Ted Bundy, your cousin, become celebrities?
Yeah, I mean, people are fascinated with true crime. They can't get enough of it. I never have been. Probably because of this. I never watched any of those things about Ted Bundy until I started researching for this book. I didn't read anything about him. I was appalled by the attention that he got. But it's a fact of life. He epitomizes a certain character in history, and let's face it, I'm a student of history. I majored in history at the University of Washington, and this, unfortunately, I'm tied to this particular historical figure, and I think that, people just can't get enough of it. I don't know why, but they do.
What are your feelings about him now?
Well, I still am appalled at what he did and don't understand it. I don't think anybody can understand what he did. You have to speculate what happened to him in his life that caused him to do something like this. And I still care deeply about the Ted Bundy that I knew, but I horrifically despise the Ted Bundy that he became and what he did to people.
Does any part of you still love him as a cousin that you did once love?
I still love what I thought was Ted Bundy, but was he really that person? I don't know.
He had, I believe, one daughter called Rose. Do you have any contact with her?
I do not. I'm sure she's trying to stay out of the, she doesn't want to be a public figure either, and I don't blame her at all. So no connection at all with her.
It's an extraordinary story. It's an extraordinary book, mainly because of the normality that he exuded, and yet underneath it, his admission to you that he felt no remorse, no guilt. He felt nothing. What's done is done. It's so calculating. No. It's so, I would say, having interviewed a lot of serial killers and medically diagnosed psychopaths, he shows every sign of being a legitimate psychopath, where they're incapable of feeling guilt and remorse and things like that. They just can't feel it. So, you can get as sort of enraged by them as you want. It makes no difference to them because they don't feel those emotions in the way that we do.
Yeah, exactly right. No empathy whatsoever. And didn't feel bad for what he did at all. In fact, he wanted to, let the past be the past. Bygones be bygones. Let's look forward to the future. And my contention in all those letters that I wrote is that, if I had cut off my arm, it would still be missing today. So you can't discount the past 100%. It still is going to affect you, and you have to be responsible for what you did. And he was not accountable whatsoever for what he did.
Do you feel lucky, Edna, that you're still alive, that you weren't killed by him?
I would never have thought that Ted would have ever done anything to harm me until those moments that I was sitting alone with him in the car. It was as if I looked through the wrong end of a telescope at this person across this huge expanse of my car. And I realized then what a risk it was to ride around alone with a serial killer who had just recently murdered somebody. In fact, I considered crashing my car. That I went through in my head all the scenarios of what I would do if he made a move. I was literally going to steer the car into a wall or whatever it was to wreck it. I wasn't going to let him, I wasn't going to go down easy.
Right, amazing though. Amazing you had to think like that.
Yeah.
The book is called Dark Tide, Growing Up with Ted Bundy. It's a riveting read. And Edna, I really thank you for coming on Uncensored and being so open about this. It must be so strange to be linked with somebody like Ted Bundy, particularly given the feelings you had for him until the moment you realized that suddenly this was that guy, that he was a ruthless and appalling serial killer. And at that moment, everything changed for him, for you, for everyone. But I thank you very much for joining me. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.